The man's smile was wide, predatory, as he leaned in, his beer breath sour against a quiet night. "You lost, boy," he sneered. Jamal Carter didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. But trouble doesn't care about silence, it strikes when you least expect it. A drink spilled, a shove, a slur, then a shot. Just like that, Jamal, top of his med school class, a future neurosurgeon, was gone. The bar fell silent, the shooter unmoved, finishing his drink, like nothing had happened. They called it self-offense. They said Jamal had attacked first. But what they didn't know was that Jamal wasn't just another young man in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was the son of Andre Carter, a tired FBI, a man who had seen war, who built weapons and erased threats with chilling precision, a man trained to track, to hunt, and to take down those who think they're untouchable. When he buried his son, he didn't just mourn, he prepared, and now, the killers were on his list. No one is safe. This is the story of a father's grief, methodical and relentless, and the justice the system never served. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, a reminder of time passing in the quiet apartment. Jamal Carter sat at his small desk, the soft hum of the city outside blending with the sounds of pages turning and quiet thoughts. At 24, Jamal had already surpassed expectations, top of his class in medical school, with a passion for neurosurgery that was as sharp as his precision in the lab. He was a young man of rare talent, someone everyone thought would go on to change the world, and he intended to do just that. He wasn't just living for himself. He was living for something greater, something his father, Andre, had taught him to value above all else. Legacy, honor, sacrifice, in the modest apartment they had shared for years in downtown Chicago. Jamal had a carefully curated life. It wasn't about the fancy things, the fast cars, or the parties that many of his classmates flocked to. No, his life was simpler, focused on the future. His desk was filled with neuroanatomy textbooks, diagrams of the human brain, and stacks of medical journals, but alongside those were framed photos that kept him grounded. There was one of his mother, who had passed when he was just a boy, smiling proudly in her nursing uniform, a picture of Jamal as a child, sitting on his father's shoulders in a park, eyes wide with wonder. Andre had raised Jamal alone after his mother died of cancer, and while Jamal had always excelled in his studies, his father had ensured that ambition never overshadowed the importance of family, compassion, and justice. Andre had always been the quiet type, but there was an undeniable presence about him, the kind of man who had once been in the CIA, training in the shadows, erasing threats with a cold calculation that left no trace. And yet, he was a man who, after all those years in the service, chose to live a quiet, almost reclusive life. But that didn't mean the past stayed buried. Not for long. And as Jamal looked at his phone, scrolling through a text from his father, the weight of his father's quiet strength seemed to hang over him. "Don't forget to check in with me tonight. Son, love you." It was just a simple text, but it carried more than just the message of a father's concern. It was a reminder that no matter how much the world changed, the bond between father and son remained unshaken. That bond, like everything in life, was anchored in something deeply rooted: respect for hard work, integrity, and the sacrifices they'd both made to get to this point. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange hue over the city, Jamal set down his textbooks and grabbed his jacket. It was Friday evening, and after the last grueling week of finals, he was finally ready for a break. A friend, Ryan Bell, a classmate from rural Missouri, had invited him out for drinks. Ryan was one of the few people Jamal had befriended who didn't treat him differently because of his background or academic success. He was genuine, no pretense, no judgment. So, despite a small hesitation, Jamal agreed. Ryan had mentioned that they were meeting up at O'Reilly's Tavern, a place he frequented whenever he visited home. Jamal took one last glance at the photo of his mother on the desk, and shot a quick text back to his dad, telling him he was stepping out for a drink. Then, locking the door behind him, he headed out into the cool evening air. The streets of downtown Chicago were bustling with people heading out to their weekend plans, but as Jamal drove away from the city toward rural Missouri, the world began to change. The highway was quieter, the lights dimmer. Fields replaced the looming skyscrapers. His phone signal dropped to a faint bar, and Jamal couldn't help but feel the creeping discomfort of leaving the city he knew so well. The small town of Alder Creek, where O'Reilly's Tavern stood, seemed like a world away from the academic halls Jamal was accustomed to. The streets were wide and empty, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, and there was a comforting stillness in the air. But even as he pulled into the gravel parking lot outside the tavern, a subtle unease tugged at his chest. His eyes flicked over the building, noting the Confederate flag hanging limp in the breeze, the faded neon signs glowing weakly in the windows. Jamal's hands tightened on the steering wheel, but he pushed the feeling aside. He wasn't here to make a statement. He was here to unwind, to have a beer and catch up with Ryan. Ryan, already holding a beer, waved enthusiastically from the entrance as Jamal parked. Jamal gave a small nod in return, his unease melting just slightly in the warmth of his classmates' friendly gesture. He stepped out of the car, his sneakers crunching against the gravel, feeling the weight of his thoughts momentarily lift as he approached the door. Inside, the music played softly, blending with the clink of pool balls and the low murmur of conversation. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, and the harsh light cast long shadows across the wooden tables. The patrons were mostly older men, dressed in faded denim jackets and baseball caps, their voices dropping into silence as Jamal entered. He had grown up in cities where the quiet was always accompanied by danger. When the world went silent, it was usually a signal of something more threatening lurking beneath. But here, it wasn't fear that filled the air, it was something subtler, more insidious. The moment Jamal stepped inside, he felt the eyes on him, the way the silence stretched a bit too long, the way the men at the pool table shifted uncomfortably. Ryan patted Jamal on the back, his voice light as he joked about needing Jamal's help to pass his next neuro and anatomy exam. Jamal smiled weakly, sitting down at the table near the back wall, beneath a mounted deer's head. He tried to relax, tried to settle into the familiar cadence of conversation, but there was a tension in the air he couldn't shake. He didn't want to be paranoid, but everything about this place felt off. As the night wore on, Jamal found himself glancing toward the door more often than usual, his unease growing with every passing minute. He wasn't here to start trouble, he just wanted a drink and a quiet evening. But the weight of the looks, the hushed conversations, the feeling of being watched, pressed down on him like a storm waiting to break. And in that moment, he realized, this wasn't just a night out with friends. This was the beginning of something else, something he couldn't quite see yet, but the air was thick with it. The foreshadowing was subtle, yet it loomed. Jamal was unaware that his life was about to shift in an instant. What was meant to be a simple night out was about to unravel everything he had worked for, everything his father had instilled in him. As the evening progressed, the tension would rise, and the story of Jamal Carter, the young man who only wanted to help, to heal, to serve, would come to a tragic, unexpected end. The warmth of the evening faded with the setting sun, the shadows growing longer, deeper, and the storm in the air began to make itself known. The air inside O'Reilly's tavern grew heavier with every passing moment. Jamal could feel it like a weight pressing against his chest, a static charge building beneath the surface. The laughter, the clink of glasses, and the rhythmic tap of pool balls against one another had a hollow, almost eerie quality tonight. The light from the neon signs outside flickered faintly, casting a pale glow on the dust-coated windows. Jamal shifted uncomfortably in his seat, trying to dismiss the growing unease crawling up his spine. He was here to relax, but the looks, the eyes that followed him everywhere told a different story. Ryan was still talking, still oblivious to the tension in the air as he rambled on about some clinical class that had him on edge. Jamal nodded politely, but his mind was elsewhere. Every creak of the old wooden floors, every whisper, every shift in the room, made him more aware that he didn't belong here, not just because of the stairs, but because of the quiet hostility wrapped in those glances, the kind of hostility that only exists in small towns where the past clings like a thick fog. Jamal had always been one to brush off discomfort, to look past the stairs and keep his focus on his goals. But tonight was different. Something in the air was wrong, and he couldn't shake it. The bartender, a tall man with a thick mustache, slid a coaster onto the counter without a word. He didn't make eye contact as he placed the beer in front of Jamal, just going through the motions like he'd done 1,000 times before. Glass was warm, the beer flat. Jamal couldn't help but feel the weight of every gaze in the room as he took a sip. It was supposed to be just a drink, but something about this place, something about these people made it feel like an interrogation. That it didn't take long before the first comment came. "Hey, look who's here." A voice from across the room, loud and cutting, carrying over the low hum of conversation. "You lost, boy." Jamal's stomach tightened, and his hand instinctively gripped the edge of the table. His gaze flicked toward the man who had spoken, a burly figure sitting at the bar with a group of friends. His face was flush, eyes glazed over with too many drinks. but his words landed with sharp clarity. Jamal didn't answer. He didn't have to. The way his body tensed, the way his eyes flickered toward Ryan, who was still blissfully unaware of the storm brewing, said it all. Jamal wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding people like him. Ryan noticed the shift in Jamal's demeanor, his tone immediately changing. "You okay?" he asked, his voice a little quieter now. "Yeah, I'm fine," Jamal replied, forcing a smile, just not used to being the center of attention. He tried to make light of it, but the unease remained, and then, the next wave hit. Another voice, louder this time, cutting through the tension. "You're in the wrong place, man." Jamal's jaw clenched, his instincts telling him to stay calm, to keep the peace. He could feel the heat rise in his chest, the familiar fire of anger and frustration beginning to stir, but he swallowed it down. He wasn't here to fight. He wasn't here to make a statement. He was here to unwind after a long week of exams. But the room didn't want to let him relax. A glass crashed onto the floor behind him, shattering against the wooden boards. Jamal's head whipped around to see a young man, a college-aged guy, his face scrunched up in a mix of drunken laughter and disdain, standing too close. He had bumped into another patron, spilling his drink. His eyes locked onto Jamal with a sneer, and that's when the slur came. "You're lucky we let you in here, you piece of shit." The man slurred, his words laced with venom. "This isn't a place for your kind." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Time seemed to slow as Jamal's heartbeat echoed in his ears. His mind raced. He wanted to leave. He wanted to step outside, take a deep breath, get in his car, and drive back to Chicago, back to his life where the ugliness of this kind of hatred was a rare, distant thing. But he couldn't move. His body froze, caught between the instinct to defend himself and the desire to avoid escalating things. Ryan, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, stood up quickly, his voice wavering as he tried to calm things down. "Hey, man, that's enough. He didn't do anything to you." But the crowd was already shifting. Like animals sensing weakness, the men at the bar began to stand up, moving toward Jamal with deliberate slowness. The laughter stopped. The air grew colder, the room now a predator's den, and Jamal realized that everything he had felt when he walked in, the tension, the hostility, wasn't in his head. It was real. It was dangerous. "Let's take this outside." Then one of the men grunted, stepping forward. His face was red, his fists already clenched. He wasn't going to back down, and neither was Jamal, but Jamal wasn't looking for a fight. He just wanted to get through the night without being the target of this kind of ignorance. Jamal stood slowly, his hands raised in a calming gesture. "I don't want any trouble," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, his tone even, but the crowd wasn't listening anymore. The words no longer mattered. The shove came first. It was sudden, hard and unexpected force that sent Jamal stumbling backward into the bar. He caught himself against the edge of the counter, his heart hammering in his chest. The room went silent. Every pair of eyes was on him now. The man who had shoved him took a step forward, his face twisted in a sneer. "You think you're too good for this place, huh? Too good for us?" Jamal shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not here to fight. I just want to leave." But the words fell on deaf ears. The next punch came like a wave, fast, angry, and fueled by a mob mentality. It hit Jamal hard in the jaw, sending a sharp pain through his skull. The room erupted in chaos, shouting, shoving, the sound of chairs scraping against the wooden floor. Ryan shouted his name, but Jamal couldn't hear him over the roar of blood rushing in his ears. Instinct kicked in. Jamal's hands came up, pushing the man who had thrown the punch away. He wasn't fighting back, he was defending himself. His body reacted on pure adrenaline, but the moment the fight shifted, he realized how outnumbered he truly was. Another punch came, this time from the side, knocking Jamal off balance. He staggered backward, his hand gripping the edge of the bar for support. The next thing he knew, he heard a deafening crack. The air grew thick with tension. Everyone froze. The only sound that filled the silence was the loud, metallic ring of a gunshot. Jamal's body jerked, and for a second time seemed to stop. He looked down, his hand pressing against his chest where the blood was already pooling. His legs gave out, and he collapsed, hitting the floor with a sickening thud. The room was still. No one moved. The shooter Eli Murdoch stood there, his gun still raised, eyes wide, but unmoved. The barrel smoked faintly, and with an unsettling calmness, he lowered it and took a step back. Sitting back down at the bar as if nothing had happened, Jamal's breath came in shallow gasps as he lay on the cold, sticky floor. His vision blurred, his world grew smaller, more distant. His hand reached out for anything to hold onto, but his fingers touched nothing. His last thoughts weren't of revenge. or justice, or even the pain in his chest. They were of his father, of Andre, the man who had sacrificed everything to make sure Jamal had a better life. He had to be proud. Jamal had done it. He had made it. He was going to be a doctor, a neurosurgeon, but that dream was slipping away with every breath. Outside, the night was still and quiet, but inside, everything was about to change. No one moved to help him. No one rushed to stop the blood that spread across the floor. The room was frozen in the aftermath. Hushed murmurs, the sound of a bottle clinking against glass, the low hum of a jukebox. The world moved on, just as it always did. But Jamal Carter was gone. And the system, the people who were supposed to protect him, would not and could not stop what was coming next. The phone rang at 1:42 a.m. Andre Carter had been sitting in his dimly lit living room, the TV flickering in the background, the soft hum of a distant train cutting through the night. His mind was occupied with thoughts of his son. Jamal had been texting him earlier in the evening, a quick check-in, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, after the text, the silence, no call, no follow-up message, just the stillness that was now creeping its way into his bones. Andre had lived a life full of silence, the kind that came with a career in the CIA, where every decision was made with calm calculation and cold resolve. He was used to compartmentalizing, to locking away emotions behind iron walls. But tonight, the stillness felt different. Something gnawed at him, pulling him closer to the edge of a precipice he hadn't expected. The phone vibrated again, this time more urgently. Andre's hand trembled as he reached for it. His instincts kicked in before his eyes even caught the name on the screen. His heart sank. The voice on the other end was clinical, too calm, as if delivering news that had been rehearsed 1,000 times before. "We regret to inform you that your son, Jamal Carter, is deceased. He was found at O'Reilly's Tavern in Alder Creek. It appears he was involved in an altercation that led to a fatal shooting." The words were like a punch to the gut, yet Andre didn't flinch. His mind raced, but the shock didn't come, not yet. Instead, there was a strange stillness in his chest, a coldness he recognized. It was the calm of someone who had been trained to handle chaos, to never let emotions get in the way of what needed to be done. "Where is he?" Andre's voice was steady, almost detached, as if the man on the other end hadn't just told him that his son was gone. "At the coroner's office. We need you to come identify the body." The call ended without another word. Andre sat there for what felt like an eternity, his eyes staring at the screen. The reality of the words slowly sinking in. Jamal, his son, dead. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, letting the cold shock of it wash over him. That was then that the old memories started to surface. The flashes of his life before Jamal, before the quiet, suburban life he had built after retiring from the CIA. His hands shook as he gripped the armrest of the couch, trying to steady himself. The image of his son, so full of life, so driven, so damn smart, was replaced with the memory of the things he had done. During his years in the field, Andre had never been one for sentimentality. He had been trained to compartmentalize, to become a machine when needed. He'd erased targets, hunted down threats, built tools of war with the cold precision of a man who knew what it meant to protect those he loved by any means necessary. His years in the CIA had taught him how to operate in the shadows, to stay out of sight, to strike without leaving a trace. And now, as he sat there in his living room, the weight of his grief pressed against that training. It was a strange battling with the need for action, rage suffocated by methodical thinking. The phone call had been a trigger, a tipping point. Andre's mind snapped back into focus, his fingers already moving to the metal case hidden behind the drywall in his workshop. It was an old relic from his past tools, weapons, a series of encrypted drives, and most importantly, a list. The government had hoped it would stay buried, but Andre knew that when things went wrong, when the system failed, the only way to fix it was by doing things the way he had always known. The CIA had trained him for moments like this. He had learned to build the weapons he had learned to hunt, and now he was going to use everything he had ever learned to hunt the men who had taken his son. The list was short, but it was enough. Names, faces, all of them linked to that night. The men who had killed Jamal. The system would never bring them to justice, not the way they deserved, not the way his son deserved. The law would protect them, the witnesses would lie, and the truth would remain buried. But Andre wasn't bound by those rules. He closed the case with a soft click, the finality of the motion settling over him like the calm before a storm. His heart was still, the grief that had been clawing at him now buried beneath an avalanche of purpose. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate, as if every action, every choice, had already been planned. There would be no more crying, no more questioning, no more wondering if Jamal could have been saved. Andre had always been the type to keep his emotions in check, but the grief now felt different, more dangerous, more consuming. It wasn't just sadness, it was a fire that would burn until it was done. Andre's mind worked as he moved through the motions of his old life. He started with the tools he knew best, the burner phones, the encrypted drives, the black market connections that could get him everything he needed. He knew how to erase himself from the system. He had done it before. He could disappear in a second, become a ghost again. And this time, he wasn't hunting threats for the government. He wasn't protecting a country. He was hunting for his son's killers. The phone calls he made were short, efficient, a few words here and there to secure weapons, to arrange for the fake IDs and burner phones that would allow him to move undetected. His old contacts had been waiting for a call like this, people who owed him, people who respected him. It didn't take long for them to do their part. By the time the sun began to rise over the city, Andre had everything he needed. His plan was set in motion. There was no turning back now. The grief was there, deep and heavy, but it was secondary. The system had failed, but Andre hadn't. He was ready, and he would stop at nothing to make sure those men paid for what they had done to Jamal. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the window, Andre stood still for a moment, staring at the photo of Jamal on his desk. He thought about his son's smile, his ambition, the future that had been stolen in an instant. Andre knew that the pain would never go away. But he also knew that the path ahead was the only one he could walk. A path defined by purpose, by revenge, and by the need to make the world right again. For Jamal, for justice, he took one last look at the house, at the life he had built, then turned and walked toward the door. The world would change now, but Andre Carter would make sure that the men responsible for his son's death would not escape what was coming. The hunter had become the hunted, and there would be no mercy. The city's skyline was barely visible through the dense fog. The gray morning light only further obscuring the world outside. Andre Carter didn't need to look out the window. He knew the city. He had navigated its streets and shadows for years, both in uniform and out of it. But today, everything felt different. He wasn't moving through this world with the ease of a retired man. No, today he was moving like a ghost, with the precision of a man who knew exactly what needed to be done and how little time he had to do it. The morning after the phone call, Andre had already begun making his preparations. His apartment, once a haven for the quiet life he'd tried to build, had transformed into a makeshift command center. He stood in front of the metal case that held everything he needed, a life he had left behind but never truly forgotten. Tools, weapons, encrypted drives, burner phones, fake IDs, documents, a list of names, the kind of list that meant someone had crossed a line they couldn't erase. And that someone would not be left to hide behind the shield of their privilege, of their lies. He was no longer just the father of Jamal Carter, he was the hunter. Andre's mind snapped back into focus as he began dialing. The calls were quick, cold, efficient, devoid of any emotion beyond purpose. Every contact was a link to the next, a man who could get him the best weapons, a woman who could provide the documents, a former colleague in the FBI who could run background checks on the men responsible for Jamal's death. One by one, the pieces started to fall into place. Each piece was a step closer to the men who had taken everything from him. That as he tracked down each of the murderers, he relied on the same skills that had kept him alive in hostile situations for decades. His old connections within law enforcement and the intelligence community were invaluable. But he wasn't just relying on favors. Andre was methodical. He pieced together the puzzle with surgical precision, examining every detail, the shooters, social media accounts, their connections to local gangs, their families. Nothing was off limits. He combed through their personal lives, their criminal records, any traces they'd left behind. The scent of a trail was unmistakable once you knew how to follow it. As the days wore on, Andre felt the tension mounting. Inside him, the pursuit was both personal and methodical. There was no room for error. The killers Eli Murdoch and the men who had circled Jamal in that bar were still out there, blending in with the chaos of the world they inhabited, unaware that someone was hunting them. Eli Murdoch was the first target. Andre found him, not in some remote hideaway, but in a rundown trailer on the outskirts of Alder Creek. The man who had pulled the trigger and ended Jamal's life wasn't hiding behind a fortified wall or in a luxury condo. He was living among the forgotten, his existence as murky and unremarkable as the town he called home. Andre watched him from a distance for days, studying his routine, the way he drank too much at the local bar, the way he stumbled home, the way his eyes darted nervously whenever a car passed by. Eli was exactly who Andre had expected him to be, a man living on the edge of desperation, drowning his guilt in alcohol, pretending that the violence he'd committed didn't haunt him. But Andre knew better. He knew what kind of man could kill another in cold blood and not flinch. He knew the kind of man who could walk away from it and convince himself it was justified. Andre had been watching Eli for days, tracking his every move with the patience of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. The father in him burned with rage, but the hunter in him knew better than to act on impulse. He knew the importance of patience, of waiting until everything lined up just right. And when it did, he would strike without hesitation. The first real obstacle came, in the form of the police. The local sheriff's department was starting to take notice of the string of accidents that seemed to be happening around the town. A few small-time criminals had been found dead under suspicious circumstances, and word had started to spread. Sheriff Green, the man who had so carelessly dismissed Jamal's murder as an unfortunate accident, had begun to get nervous. His deputies, more than a little concerned about the mounting deaths in a small town like theirs, were starting to talk. Andre's old instincts kicked in. He wasn't going to let the police get involved. Not yet. He wasn't going to let anyone get close to discovering what he was doing. He'd spent years learning how to disappear, how to stay off the radar, and this was no different. He would have to be smarter, faster. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. One night, as Andre sat in his car across from the sheriff's office, watching Green and his deputies through the window, a bead of sweat rolled down his forehead. He knew that they were getting closer. They were beginning to piece things together. Their growing suspicion was the one thing that could derail his entire plan, but he had learned to think quickly. He wasn't just going to run, he wasn't going to back down, he was going to use their suspicion against them. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Andre had planted a few carefully chosen clues, leaving behind traces that would point the investigation in the wrong direction. He made sure to cover his tracks, disturbing the scene just enough to throw them off the scent. He left behind a few false leads, just enough to keep them busy for days. While the police scurried around chasing shadows, Andre focused on his next target, Ryan Bell, the only witness to Jamal's murder, the only person who knew the truth. He had to make sure Ryan stayed quiet. He couldn't afford another loose end. Andre had no intention of killing Ryan. No, Ryan was a pawn, a necessary part of the puzzle. He knew that Ryan's guilt would drive him to the brink of insanity, and Andre could use that to his advantage. So, he followed Ryan's movements, tracking his every move, watching him from the shadows. The young man had become paranoid, his every step fraught with fear. He'd begun to piece together what had happened that night at O'Reilly's tavern, but he wasn't ready to speak out, not yet done in one of his late-night visits to Ryan's apartment. Andre had left a warning, a single bullet, engraved with Jamal's initials, placed on Ryan's kitchen table. He had no intention of killing Ryan, but he needed the boy to know that the truth had consequences. Silence was golden, and Andre would make sure that Ryan remained quiet. The tension in the air grew thicker with each passing day. Andre could feel it building, a sense of urgency gnawing at him, pushing him forward. But every move had to be calculated. Every decision had to be precise. He wasn't just hunting down killers, he was making a statement, one that would resonate long after the dust had settled. And with each moment that passed, with each piece of the puzzle that clicked into place, Andre felt something stirred deep inside of him. It was no longer just about justice for Jamal, it was about something deeper, something more visceral. It was about the need for control, the need to make the world right again. But even in his methodical pursuit, Andre knew that mistakes could happen, and one wrong step could lead to everything unraveling. He was closing in. He could feel it. The killers were just a few steps ahead of him, living their lives unaware that a storm was coming for them. But when the storm hit, it would hit hard, and there would be no mercy, each step bringing him closer to the inevitable. There was no turning back now. The small town of Alder Creek felt like a pressure cooker, its simmering heat intensifying with every passing hour. It had been days since Andre had started the final phase of his plan, and now, with everything in motion, there was no turning back. The killer's Eli Murdoch, the man who had pulled the trigger, and his accomplices were on the run, but they had no idea the hunter had already set his trap. The town, with its old, dusty roads and quiet streets, was no longer the sleepy little community it had once been. The air crackled with tension, as if the whole town was waiting for something to break. Andre watched them from the shadows, his heart beating in time with the rhythmic ticking of his watch. His pulse was steady, but his mind was racing. He had spent days tracking their every move, studying their habits, and now, after everything, the lies, the cover-up, the injustice, he was ready to face them. The fog had rolled in thick that morning, shrouding the world in a ghostly veil. Andre had used the cover of the mist to move undetected, setting up surveillance in the alleys, following the men as they unknowingly moved through their daily lives. He watched Eli Murdoch pick up a six-pack of beer from the corner store, laughing with his friends like nothing had happened. The audacity of it, the sheer calmness with which he went about his life, knowing he had killed a man, sent a wave of fury through Andre. The sight of it made his blood burn hotter than the summer sun. Tonight would be different. Tonight, there would be no more hiding. Tonight, there would be a reckoning. Eli had no idea what was coming for him. He didn't know that Andre Carter, a man he thought had been lost to time, was already in the shadows, tracking his every move. The others, his accomplices, were no better off. They thought they were safe, but they weren't. Not anymore. Andre had spent years training for moments like this. When everything in his life led him to a point of no return, he had erased threats for the government, had hunted down dangerous men in the darkest corners of the world. But this was personal. These weren't nameless, faceless targets. These were the men who had taken his son from him, who had murdered Jamal without consequence. And Andre wasn't about to let them slip through his fingers. The confrontation began slowly. One by one, he'd lured them into the net. First, Eli, followed by the two men who had surrounded Jamal that night. They weren't hard to find after all. Small towns had a way of keeping secrets hidden in plain sight. Andre knew exactly where they would be, knew the routes they would take, the places they would hide. All it took was a phone call, a few planted pieces of misinformation, and the killers were walking right into his trap. The night had fallen, and the streets of Alder Creek were empty, save for the occasional passing car. Andre stood across from the old diner on the outskirts of town, the perfect vantage point. The killers were coming. They had no idea. The mist curled around him like a cloak, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath his boots as he moved silently into position. Every step, every breath, was deliberate. It had to be. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Andre waited, the shadows wrapping around him like a second skin. He wasn't just hunting them. He was waiting for the right moment, the moment when their lives would change forever. The first of the men appeared, moving sluggishly down the alley, talking loudly and laughing as if nothing had happened. Andre's eyes narrowed. He was close. Now, so close. The man stepped forward, and just as he did, Andre struck. A flash of movement, a swift, calculated motion. The man was on the ground in seconds, his hands pinned to the dirt by Andre's unyielding strength. He didn't scream, he didn't beg. He had been trained for moments like this. He knew exactly what had to be done. With one swift motion, Andre disabled the man's phone, cutting off the connection to the outside world. No one was going to help him. No one was going to warn Eli and his accomplices. Tonight, justice would be served. Tension in the air grew thicker as the next man arrived. The second target. Andre's eyes flicked toward him, and in that moment, everything seemed to freeze. The realization hit the man like a bolt of lightning. He looked up, locking eyes with Andre. He knew who this was. You, ... You're that CIA guy, aren't you? The man stammered. Andre's lips curled into a faint, cold smile. Not anymore, he said softly, the words carrying the weight of a decade of silence. He stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. The second man backed away, his hands raised in surrender. Look, we didn't mean for any of this to happen. We didn't know who he was. He came in asking for trouble. It was self-defense. Andre's fist struck with the force of years of training. The man crumpled, gasping for breath. Andre didn't speak again, didn't offer any more words of explanation. There was nothing left to say. Justice wasn't about excuses. Justice wasn't about justification. It was about balance. And the scales had been tipped far too far in the wrong direction. Now, only one target remained. The final man, Nell Murdoch. The one who had fired the shot, the one who had pulled the trigger and ended Jamal's life. That it wasn't hard to find him. He was in the same place Andre had predicted, sitting on the same bench outside the bar, the same smug look on his face, the same air of invincibility that came with being untouchable. Eli had no idea that the world was about to crash down on him. Andre stood in the shadows, watching the mist swirled around them, the silence broken only by the soft sounds of the night. Eli had his back turned, leaning against the wall with his beer bottle in hand. He had no idea what was coming. Andre's voice broke the silence. You didn't think this day would come, did you? Eli froze. His hand trembled slightly, the beer bottle almost slipping from his fingers. He turned slowly, and when his eyes met Andre's, a flicker of recognition crossed his face. Carter, Eli muttered. his voice shaking slightly. I didn't know. You didn't know, Andre repeated, his tone colder than the night air. Your kind never knows. You never think there's someone out there who will make you answer for what you've done. Eli stood frozen, his body rigid. He knew who Andre was. He knew what he was capable of. But it was too late. It had always been too late. The tension between them was suffocating. The air was thick with it, and every second felt like a ticking clock counting down to the inevitable. Andre stepped forward, his hand moving to the gun holstered at his side. The gun that had been a tool of justice for a lifetime, now a tool for revenge. I have a choice to make, Andre said, his voice low, but steady. I could end your life, and you would never even see it coming. Or I could let you rot in a jail cell, where you'll live the rest of your life knowing what you did. Eli's eyes darted between Andre and the gun. His breath came faster, his body trembling. Please, he begged, his voice a broken whisper. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to kill him. But Andre didn't care about apologies. Apologies wouldn't bring Jamal back. The choice was clear. Andre's hand tightened around the grip of the gun, but as he took a step forward, a strange calm washed over him. This wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about satisfying a thirst for blood. It was about balance. It was about ensuring that what had been taken could never be forgotten. The gunshot rang out with deadly precision. Eli collapsed, the bullet striking him cleanly, ending his life in an instant. No dramatic last words, no final moments, just silence. Andre stood over him for a long moment, his chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. His mind was still, his purpose fulfilled. It was done. The father had confronted the killers, the scales had been balanced, and in the quiet aftermath, Andre realized something. This wasn't closure. It wasn't justice in the traditional sense. It was just a man doing what needed to be done. Nothing more, nothing less. And with that, he disappeared into the night. The air hung heavy as the last echo of the gunshot faded into the night. Eli Murdoch lay motionless on the gravel, his body crumpled like a discarded puppet whose strings had been cut. For a moment there was no sound but the rustling of leaves in the breeze, and Andre stood over him, the weight of his decision pressing down like a storm cloud ready to burst. The gun, still warm in his hand, felt foreign now. It had been an instrument of his past, an extension of his training, his instincts, but it was no longer just a tool for justice. It was a tool of vengeance. And in the stillness that followed the shot, Andre realized something that he had never truly allowed himself to confront. Vengeance didn't bring peace. It didn't bring closure. It only deepened the wound. His chest tightened, and he felt an unfamiliar ache settle deep in his bones. His son Jamal was still gone. The man responsible for his death was now dead as well, but the world had not stopped turning. It had not given him what he expected, a sense of justice, of balance restored. There was no satisfaction in this moment. There was only the quiet, creeping knowledge that this wasn't how he had imagined it. The price of revenge had come at the cost of something much more precious than his son's life. Andre's hand trembled as he lowered the gun. The numbness he had felt in the hours leading up to this moment, the calm, cold precision that had guided his every step, was gone. In its place was a raw emptiness, a void that seemed to swallow everything else. The tension in his shoulders loosened, but the weight of what he had done hung around him like a shroud. He had known, deep down, that there was no turning back. When the bullet had left the barrel, there had been no part of him that doubted this was the right thing to do. But now, standing over Eli's lifeless body, Andre felt the crushing toll of his actions. It wasn't just the loss of his son that haunted him, it was the cost of the man he had become. He looked down at Eli, the cold emptiness of the moment reflecting back in the dead man's vacant eyes. Andre could feel the pull of the past, the memories of the work he had done as a CIA operative, the people he had hunted, the lives he had taken. But that was a lifetime ago. The years had blurred the edges of those memories, but in this moment, they became clear again. The man he had been before his son's death, before the quiet life he had built after retirement, was slipping away. Andre took a long, steady breath, the silence settling around him like a tomb. His eyes flicked back to the small town of Alder Creek, where the quiet had once seemed comforting, where the peace had felt real. Now it felt like a hollow illusion. The world didn't change for the better with this kind of justice. It didn't make anyone feel whole again. He knelt beside Eli's body, his movements slow and deliberate, as though every part of him was resisting the reality of what had just unfolded. He had killed for a reason, he had done it for Jamal. But the weight of it, the moral cost, felt unbearable now that the deed was done. Was it worth it? Was it worth the toll on his soul? The questions circled in his mind, but no answers came. He hadn't just killed a man, he had killed part of himself. The man who had stood in the shadows for years, erasing threats for the government, had crossed a line he hadn't anticipated. Revenge had a way of changing you. It didn't heal wounds, it deepened them. Andre stood, the gun still in his hand, his fingers clutching it tighter, as if trying to keep the world from slipping away. The fog around him seemed to close in, heavy and suffocating. For the first time in his life he felt truly alone. Jamal's death had shattered him, but this moment, the moment when he took Eli's life, had broken something deeper inside him. He let out a shaky breath and holstered the gun. There was no joy in this. There would be no peace. What had he expected? That this would bring his son back? That the world would somehow right itself? He had taken lives before, but this was different. This was his son, his flesh and blood, and every choice he made from that moment on would be defined by the loss of him. The decision to pull the trigger had been his alone. The consequences of that decision would follow him for the rest of his life. He looked down at Eli one last time, the man now just another casualty of his pain, and felt a wave of sickness wash over him. Justice or vengeance? The question gnawed at him as he turned away from the body, walking slowly toward the car he had parked further down the road. The headlights cut through the fog, casting long shadows behind him. Andre didn't look back. He couldn't. As he drove away from the town, he tried to convince himself that it was over, that there was no turning back, that he had made the only choice he could. But the doubt lingered, gnawing at the edges of his mind, as sharp as the ache in his chest. He thought about his son, about Jamal's dreams, his future, the life that had been stolen from him, and Andre wondered, for the first time, if this would be the end of it, or if this was just the beginning of something far darker. The road stretched ahead, winding through the countryside, the fog thickening as the miles passed. Andre's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. The night was silent, save for the low hum of the engine. The world had moved on, and so had he, but the cost was still there, lingering in the back of his mind, in the heavy weight of his thoughts. When he arrived at the small motel on the edge of town, he didn't sleep, he couldn't. Instead he sat in the dark, his mind racing with memories. Of Jamal, of the moments they had shared, of the life he had lost. The bed was cold, empty, and all Andre could hear was the echo of his own breathing. The emotional toll of his journey for revenge, for justice, for closure, was more than he could bear. There was no peace in this, no victory. The toll was too great, but it wasn't about peace anymore. It wasn't about getting things right. It was about the weight of a father's grief, a grief that had driven him to the edge, to the very place where all he could do was move forward. There was nothing left to fight for except the memory of his son and the hope, no matter how faint. Somehow, somewhere, he had honored his son's life. He closed his eyes, letting the darkness wash over him. The story of his life, the story of Jamal's life, had ended in violence, but the grief would never end. The father would carry it with him always, as a reminder of what had been lost and the price of seeking justice. In the quiet of the motel room, with the sound of his breathing echoing in the silence, Andre Carter allowed himself one last thought. Was this what Jamal would have wanted? And in that thought, the weight of the journey hung heavy on him, a shadow he would never escape. The years had passed, but the fog never really lifted. It hung over Alder Creek like a constant reminder of the darkness that had descended on the town. People still whispered about the events that had shattered their quiet lives, about the deaths, the violence, and the mysterious figure who had come from nowhere, exacting justice with cold precision. The bar that had once been a gathering place for the community now stood abandoned, the windows boarded up, the remnants of a place where laughter and arguments once filled the air now replaced by silence. The town had never fully recovered. It couldn't. As for Andre, the man who had once walked into that town with the sole intention of bringing justice for his son, he had faded into the shadows just as quickly as he had arrived. The path he had chosen, marked by blood and vengeance, had led him far from the life he once knew. The man who had been a CIA agent, a father, a protector, was gone. What remained was a shadow of a man who had sacrificed more than just his own peace. He had sacrificed the very essence of who he had been. Now, years later, Andre sat in a dimly lit room, the soft crackle of a dying fire the only sound that filled the silence. His hair had grayed at the temples, and his face, once sharp with resolve, now carried the weariness of time and regret. His hands, though still strong, trembled slightly as they rested on the table in front of him. The photo of Jamal, the son he had loved so deeply, sat in front of him, now faded and worn with time. He had never truly left Alder Creek. The town had left its mark on him, Every night he found himself wondering if he had done the right thing. Had the cost of his vengeance been worth it? As the years went by, the haunting question lingered. Had Jamal's death truly been avenged? Or had he merely become part of the same broken system, the same cycle of violence and retribution that had plagued the town for generations? The justice Andre had sought so relentlessly had come at the expense of his own soul, and now, in the quiet of his solitary existence, he wondered if there had been another way. The shadows of the past followed him, wherever he went. They were a part of him, etched into his bones, and no amount of distance could ever erase them. The town had changed. Those who had lived there all their lives now looked over their shoulders, and a quiet tension had settled over the streets. The once friendly faces had become distant, wary. The town had been divided in ways it couldn't heal, torn between those who still believed in the law and those who believed the law had failed them just as it had failed Jamal. And in the back of Andre's mind, he knew the truth. There was no justice in revenge, only the cost of living with it. He had not been able to bring his son back, but he had made sure the men who had taken him from him would never hurt anyone again. Yet, in the stillness of his thoughts, Andre wondered if justice had ever been served at all. Was it justice, or was it the simple fact that a father had taken matters into his own hands, as fathers sometimes did? The haunting didn't end with Eli's death. It didn't end with the lives of those who had stood by and watched Jamal die. It didn't end with the wreckage of the town. It continued, stretching into the horizon, a shadow Andre would never escape. The phone rang, breaking through his thoughts, like a jolt of electricity. His hand hovered over the receiver for a moment, unsure if he even wanted to pick it up. But he did. The voice on the other end was familiar, yet distant. "Mr. Carter," the voice said, calm but with an edge of uncertainty. "We've been tracking something. We thought you'd want to know." Andre's pulse quickened, but he said nothing. He had learned not to react, not to give anything away. He simply listened. "They're still out there," the voice continued. "The ones who think they can operate without consequences. We have their names, we know where they are, and we need your help." A chill ran through Andre. The hunt, it seemed, was never truly over. He hung up the phone and stared at the photo of Jamal once more. The loss, the grief, the rage, it was all still there, just beneath the surface. The cost of the vengeance he had exacted had left him hollow, but the emptiness had only grown. Would he chase justice again? Would he return to the shadows for the sake of something greater than himself? Or would the cost of what he had already lost keep him away from the very thing that had driven him to this point? As the fire crackled in the background, Andre sat in silence, the weight of his decisions bearing down on him. The journey that had started with a tragic loss and a father's relentless pursuit had brought him here into a life defined by violence, by vengeance, by the need to correct what had been broken. And as the night wore on, he wondered if he could ever find peace. The legacy of Jamal's death, and the price of the justice Andre had sought, would linger forever. For, in the end, justice was never just a matter of making things right. It was about the toll it took on the soul, the people it affected, and the consequences that followed. And for Andre Carter, the legacy of his actions was not just a reflection of the man he had been, but of the man he had become, the man he could never fully escape. And as the town continued to turn, as the world moved on, Andre Carter knew that his search for justice had never truly ended. It had only shifted, taken on a different form. The cycle of pain, of loss, of revenge, it would continue, as it always had. And in the distance, there was always the possibility of another call, another choice, another reckoning. For the father, there would never be closure, only the quiet hum of the night, the weight of the past, and the haunting knowledge that some things, some losses can never be healed.